Well, Labour have accused George Osborne of acting cynically by trying to link the Philpott case to Britain's welfare system. Much has been made of the benefits the Philpotts had been living off. Here's a summary, then, of what they were reportedly claiming. Child benefit at £20.30 a week for their eldest son and £13.40 a week for each of the other 10 children would give an annual total for all 11 children of just over £8,000 a year. If both Mairead Philpott and Mick Philpott's former girlfriend Lisa Willis, who lived under the same roof at one stage, were claiming working tax credits, they could have been receiving almost £38,500 a year. If Mick Philpott was also claiming housing benefit for their three-bedroom home, that would bring in a further £7,800 a year. Put all of it together, and the amount of tax-free benefits they may have been receiving, just under £55,000. Well, in the last few minutes, the Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls, has accused Mr Osborne of demeaning his office with nasty and divisive comments which sought to make a link between a terrible crime and the welfare system. He called it the cynical act of a desperate Chancellor. Well, Mr Osborne wanted a debate, and I'm joined now by Ruth Porter of the Institute of Economic Affairs and Owen Jones, who's a columnist with The Independent. Ruth Porter, is George Osborne right to raise this and to link these things?
Well, half right. The case probably tells us a lot more about Britain's criminal justice system and about our social services system than it does about the welfare system. But it does raise an important question, which is how can a family living in this way get around £55,000 a year of taxpayer money? It's a big problem. And if you look at the...
Irrespective of whether that contributed in some way to what happened?
I think it's clear that even if you had welfare reform and they weren't receiving that amount of money, what happened in this situation was an awful, awful, terrible tragedy. It was so complicated, and it really has very little, I think, the consequences of what happened have very little to do with the situation in terms of benefits that the family received. But that doesn't mean that he's right to raise the issue of welfare.
Owen Jones.
No, not at all. And I have to say, as a nation, I think we have to have a long think about this. The hijacking, the political hijacking of the deaths of 6 little kids who died in horrific circumstances. And the reality is...
Why is it a hijacking?
Absolutely, because what's been happening at the moment is the killing of the deaths of these 6 kids is being used to justify an assault against the welfare state by those who have a political agenda in doing so. And the point is...
But that suggests planning, doesn't it? I mean, as if this is all part of some sort of...
It's an ambush then. It's a however you want to describe it, this is being used, this case, to pass it off as though it's representative or that it says something about a welfare state. It doesn't, any more than Harold Shipman tells us about doctors, any more than last week a man who was sentenced to prison for life for killing his 2 parents to try and extort £230,000 worth of inheritance. It doesn't say anything. And we've got to stop allowing politicians to jump on these tragic cases and use them to try and turn people against each other.
That's simply not credible. This family were receiving £55,000 of taxpayer money a year. If you broaden that out and you look at the system as a whole, you've got a government that's now spending more than a quarter of all of its money on welfare. Well, you've got a system where close to half of all non-retired households in the UK are now dependent on the government for at least one major benefit, and that's even aside from child benefit.
Can we just go into what the welfare state... Can we go into what the welfare state actually is? Because you've just made a huge claim there. Over 40% goes on elderly people, pensions, for example. It goes on tax credits for millions of working people. And indeed, what's interesting is this doesn't say anything about welfare dependency, because most of the benefits would be coming from in-work benefits.
That's exactly right.
Hang on, just let me come back on... Hang on.
The reason why we have become so dependent on the welfare state is because we have had poverty lobby group after poverty lobby group that has concentrated on tackling poverty through increasing government subsidies and neglecting to focus on the fact that with rising living costs, It's focusing on how we bring down the costs of things, how we make electricity, food and housing cheaper for people so that we don't have to subsidise their incomes.
There is a debate to be had about welfare spending separate from this tragedy, and that is this. The fact that we have increasingly ended up subsidising private landlords charging extortionate rent, the fact £23 billion of taxpayers' money goes in housing benefit, not lining the pockets of the tenants, lining the pockets of landlords who know they can get away with charging extortionate rents because you and I, the taxpayer, will step in. Tax credits, again, a lifeline for millions, but they are subsidising bosses with low pay. That is a separate debate. This is what's important. The deaths of 6 children cannot be allowed to be used by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in order to make political capital as part of a crusade that this government has launched to try and turn people against each other. And this campaign, I genuinely say this and beg people watching this, decent people, to say enough is enough. We've got to stop using these stories to turn people against each other, and let's have a sensible and mature debate about the welfare state.
Of what George Osborne is saying, though, is if you take aside the sort of the crime and the death, that the state in some way enabled that lifestyle, and he's implying that that is going on all over the place. Do you actually believe that is the case, and what should we do about it if you do?
Yeah, I think if you look at the pattern of welfare in the UK, in a sense, you've got 3 groups of people who are on welfare. You've got people who are on welfare who are working, who, because of, as we've just discussed, rising living costs, are having to have their income subsidised, and there's discussions to be had about how to tackle that. There's then people who quite legitimately are vulnerable for whatever reason, whether it's for a short term or over the long term. They need to be on welfare. They need that safety net provided by the state. But then there's another group of people who are trapped in dependency. And if you look at the Chancellor's
so you would cut their benefits and force them back to work?
You have to have... We should all agree that it is simply not tenable to have a system where people can be better off on benefits than they can be in work.
Owen Jones.
The problem is not welfare dependency, it's both a lack of secure work. At the moment, I'll give you an example. Last week, in Bristol, DFS opened up a new store. 1,200 people applied for just 9 jobs. In Nottingham, Costa Coffee opened up a shop. They offered 8 near minimum wage jobs. 1,701 people applied. Desperation for work. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, there's 6.5 million people looking for full-time work, which does not exist. And indeed, and I'm sorry to just bombard figures, but we do need some facts in this discussion. In the last 2 years alone, 1 in 6 workers have claimed job seekers allowance at some point. The real issue is a lack of secure work. People actually trapped not in a welfare dependency, but in a cycle of low-paid work and benefits. That has to change by creating secure full-time work. But as I say, it is a separate debate from the deaths of 6 children.
Ruth Porter, Owen Jones, thank you both very much indeed.